I really hate my stepmother. And I don't know how to tell my dad about it without causing a big issue. I'm feeling very stuck right now. I was 5 when I lost my mother. And while I was too young to fully understand the gravity of that loss, I grew up in a home filled with my father's love. He was my rock, my hero, my best friend. I wanted to become just like him, steadfast, kind, and devoted. Every moment of my early life was shaped by the little traditions we shared. He would take me to rugby games on weekends, teach me life lessons through stories, and always be the first to reassure me when I stumbled. Life was simple then, and I was content in our small, unbreakable world. But as I reached my teenage years, my father brought someone new into our lives. Her name was Amy, and she seemed charming at first. I remember the day my father introduced her with a hopeful smile, his eyes lighting up in a way I hadn't seen before. For his sake, I wanted to believe that Amy could be the person to complete our family. He deserved happiness, and I thought I did too. When they married, I was overjoyed at the thought of finally having a family again. But the cracks began to appear sooner than I expected. Just months after the honeymoon, Amy's demeanor shifted. One morning, I woke up to her standing by my bedroom door with a cold expression. "Let's keep this simple," she said. "Around your dad, we'll pretend to like each other. But otherwise, don't bother me." I was stunned, standing there in my pajamas, not knowing what to say. This was supposed to be my stepmother, my new family, and she was already setting up walls. My dad, oblivious to all this, carried on believing we were getting along well. He saw the world through rose-colored glasses when it came to Amy, and I didn't have the heart, or the courage, to shatter his illusion. At first, I told myself that perhaps she was adjusting and that things would get better with time. But as months turned into years, her quiet hostility turned into more obvious disdain. She would make casual remarks about my looks, my weight, or even my attempts to befriend her. "You're just an awkward version of your dad," she would say with a smirk. Watching my discomfort, these little comments were daggers to my self-esteem. But I swallowed the hurt, convincing myself it was temporary. Then, one night, my world truly crumbled. My dad was away for work, and Amy threw a party for her friends. I did my best to help out, cooking and setting up as my dad had requested. As they gathered on the porch, their laughter echoing into my room, I overheard a conversation that would haunt me. One of her friends commented on how lucky Amy was to have a family. And in response, Amy sighed dramatically, saying, "If only I could get rid of that annoying kid. The minute he turns 18, he's out of here." It hit me like a punch to the gut. I stumbled back, retreating to my room as I tried to process what I just heard. I felt trapped and unwanted in my own home. I thought we had at least reached a silent understanding, that we were tolerating each other for my dad's sake. But to hear her openly admit she despised me? It shattered something inside me. For the next 2 weeks, I moved around in a daze, unable to shake the feeling of utter rejection. My safe space had become a battleground. One day, I broke down at rugby practice, my coach noticing my tears. He quietly sent me home, and I drove to the beach, hoping the solitude would clear my mind. It was the first time I truly considered seeking help, and in my desperation, I turned to Reddit, thinking that maybe, just maybe, strangers could give me advice on a situation that felt too big for me to handle alone. The flood of responses was overwhelming, filled with people who shared similar experiences and encouraging me to speak to my dad. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I wasn't alone in my struggle. But the idea of confronting my dad terrified me. What if he didn't believe me? Or worse, what if he chose Amy over me? Yet, with encouragement from others and a glimmer of newfound strength, I decided to record Amy's cruel words when I next had the chance, in case I needed proof. The night finally came when Amy pushed me over the edge. She accused me of being a troublemaker and, unbelievably, even implied I was involved in drugs. That was the final straw. I locked myself in my room, recording her hateful tirade through the door, unable to believe the lengths she would go to paint me as the villain. When my dad returned, I showed him the recording. I watched as the realization dawned on him, as he saw the side of Amy that I had endured in silence for years. He broke down, apologizing repeatedly, but I could see that he was still torn. He loved her, despite everything. I made a decision that night. I couldn't live with Amy any longer. I packed a bag and asked my rugby coach if I could stay with him temporarily. Thankfully, he agreed, opening his home and heart to me in a way I never expected. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace, even as I grappled with the pain of leaving my father behind. My coach became a pillar of support, and his family embraced me warmly, helping me rebuild the confidence that Amy had stripped away. My dad continued to reach out, asking to meet up and talk. Eventually, we started meeting once a week, each conversation slowly healing the wounds between us. One day, he promised that he would leave Amy if it meant I'd return home. But I told him it had to be his choice, not mine. I didn't want him to resent me for forcing his hand. In the meantime, I focused on my studies, aiming for a future that was finally within reach. Through therapy, I began to understand that my worth wasn't tied to Amy's approval or anyone else's. For that matter, I had spent years bending to her will, letting her words define me. Now, surrounded by people who cared for me, I was learning to reclaim my identity. As I reflect on this journey, I've come to realize that family isn't just defined by blood. It's about the people who stand by you, who lift you when you're broken. My coach and his family showed me that compassion, helping me regain my sense of self and showing me what a supportive family could truly look like. My relationship with my father is still fragile, but I know now that setting boundaries is not an act of selfishness but of self-preservation. It's a lesson I hold close, one that I'll carry forward in all my relationships. Though I still miss the family I once imagined, I'm grateful for the people who have supported me through the darkness. And I hope, one day, to pay forward the kindness that has carried me through my own battles. In this new chapter, I am ready to embrace a future where I am free to be myself. Surrounded by people who value me for who I am, I'm excited for university, where I'll major in commerce and law, and I'm hopeful that each day will bring me closer to the peace and fulfillment I've always sought. No matter how isolated you may feel, there is always hope, even if it comes from unexpected places. This story is a testament to resilience, the power of seeking support, and the importance of setting boundaries to protect your own well-being. I hope that anyone listening, who might feel lost in their own family dynamics, finds the strength to speak up, seek help, and remember that their value is never defined by someone else's opinion. My parents tried to screw over my dying stepmother, blew up all of our lives instead. Family, as we're often taught, is supposed to be a source of security and warmth, a sanctuary. I believed this myself as a child, not knowing then that family could also hide dangerous, selfish agendas. This story isn't only about betrayal, it's about discovering the strength to choose what is right in a web of manipulation. The person who taught me this wasn't my mother or father, it was my stepmother, Jane, whose compassion and strength were tested in unimaginable ways. I would watch her stand resilient, even as her health faded, guiding me through a labyrinth of broken promises and selfish acts. Growing up, my life was full of chaos. My father and mother's relationship had been rocky even before I was born. And by the time I was a toddler, they could barely be in the same room without shouting. Then came Jane. From the start, Jane brought a calm that was rare and soothing. I remember being 4 years old, confused by the turmoil around me, yet feeling an unexpected sense of stability when Jane entered our lives. She seemed unshakable, like a harbor in the storm. At first, she was just Dad's new friend. Then she became his wife. And in time, she became my rock. Jane went above and beyond, mending relationships and encouraging my parents to set aside their differences for my sake. She had a good career and a comfortable home, and she even helped my father pull himself out of financial hardship. My father, at that time, was struggling, staying in cheap hotels and barely making ends meet. But Jane, with her unwavering determination, was there to help him get back on his feet, all while ensuring I received what I needed to grow up with some semblance of normalcy. Despite my mother's resistance, Jane even managed to arrange a custody agreement, offering her home as a neutral ground. With a strong sense of duty, she treated me like her own child, even creating a room for me in her home. She shielded me from the turbulence, working tirelessly to provide me with the stability that had been sorely missing. As I look back, her quiet sacrifices formed the bedrock of my childhood, a bedrock that I would later realize was built on her compassion alone. Years went by, and my loyalty toward Jane grew stronger. She was more than just a stepmother, she was a guiding force in my life. When I reached my teenage years, Jane won a substantial lawsuit after an accident. Most people would think a big financial win means a carefree life. But Jane was different. She used that money to secure futures for me and my brothers by creating trust funds. Showing her selflessness yet again, Jane didn't indulge in luxury or flaunt her success. She simply ensured that her family, our family, was taken care of. She paid off her home and took us on modest vacations. Yet she remained focused on building a future for us. This, however, is where the shadows began to deepen. Around that time, Jane's health started to fail. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, but gradually her vibrant presence began to dull, her energy dwindling, as Jane battled her illness. My biological mother began making surprising appearances in our lives, trying to mend fences with my father. My mother had always viewed Jane with resentment, but suddenly she was playing the role of a supportive ex-wife, visiting the house frequently, acting like a surrogate mother to my brothers, and even cooking meals. I felt something dark in her intentions, a suspicion I wished wasn't true. At first, I tried to ignore it, to chalk it up to my imagination, but when I caught my mother eyeing Jane's belongings, eyeing the home that Jane had secured, and dropping subtle hints about her own financial goals, I grew wary. Her tone became oddly possessive, speaking about the house, even discussing future travel plans with my father as if she'd be by his side in the long term. I knew that my mother, a bartender who had often struggled to make ends meet, wasn't accustomed to this lifestyle. And that's when my suspicions turned to dread. I couldn't bear the thought of what my mother might be planning. So I took a brave step. I went to Jane. I remember the sterile scent of the hospital room, the faint beeps of medical monitors, and Jane's weary smile as I approached her bed. We sat in silence for a moment before I gathered the courage to ask her about my trust fund. Jane looked at me with confusion and concern as I explained my fears. I told her everything, how my mother was acting, the strange behavior between her and my father. Jane's face fell, her eyes clouded with sadness and, perhaps, the pain of betrayal. In that room, Jane made the decision that would change everything. She arranged for her lawyer to alter her will, transferring control of the trusts and the estate directly to me, excluding my father entirely. This act wasn't just about protecting the money, it was her final way of ensuring that her legacy, a safe home for me and my brothers, would be preserved. Away from my parents' destructive schemes. Days later, it all exploded. My mother stormed into the house, furious, having found out about Jane's changes to the will. The truth came out in a horrid scene. She admitted to manipulating my father, feigning love and reconciliation to gain access to Jane's wealth. The confrontation broke my father's spirit. My brothers watched, eyes wide with horror, as the twisted intentions of my parents came to light. I felt as though my world was shattering. Yet somewhere in that chaos, I felt a sense of justice, for Jane, and for the love she had given so selflessly. Jane's health continued to decline, and she passed not long after. But not before imparting one final wish. She entrusted me with the responsibility of caring for my brothers and the home she had left us. Her faith in me gave me strength, a purpose that anchored me as I faced the wreckage of my family's deceit. In the months that followed, I cut ties with my mother and distanced myself from my father. Realizing that family isn't defined by blood but by the love, sacrifice, and moral strength we share. I reflect on the small acts that led to this moment. The extra shifts Jane worked to support us, the countless nights she stayed up late to comfort me, and the way she taught me about resilience by living it herself. Through Jane, I learned that kindness is not a weakness, that true strength is shown in the face of betrayal, and that love can come from the most unexpected places. In the years that followed, I held tightly to the lessons Jane had given me. When my brothers struggled with their grief, I shared with them stories of Jane's compassion, and together, we found a way to honor her memory by creating a life filled with the values she had lived by. We faced challenges, of course, but we did so with the courage Jane had instilled in us. In the end, Jane's legacy wasn't in the money she left behind or the house she gifted us. It was in the resilience, kindness, and unwavering love she had woven into our lives. It was a love that no amount of betrayal could tarnish. A love that transformed me from a scared teenager into the guardian of her memory and the protector of her dreams for our family. Syl hated me for years, had a tragic miscarriage, then we welcomed her back. But she told my child she was his real mom. I still remember the first time I met Kathy. my husband David's sister. She was seated at the far end of the dinner table, watching me intently, a smile that seemed more predatory than warm spreading across her lips. David and I were only dating then, and I was anxious to make a good impression, but I sensed that no amount of charm or kindness would sway Kathy. She made it clear, in every subtle and not so subtle way, that she saw me as an intruder. As the months passed, Kathy's antagonistic behavior became an undercurrent in my relationship with David. She'd make snide comments, bring up David's exes as if they were some golden standard, and treat me like I was unworthy of his affection. David had warned me that Kathy was fiercely protective, but this went beyond protectiveness. It felt personal. Still, I was determined to build a family where everyone felt valued and respected. I'd always been a family-oriented person. Growing up, family meant love, loyalty, and unwavering support, but Kathy tested these ideals. She was the thorn in an otherwise perfect marriage, her jealousy a dark cloud that lingered in the background of our happy life together. When David and I finally got married, I thought Kathy would come around. She didn't. She attended our wedding but barely acknowledged me, and in the years that followed, she continued her campaign of subtle slights and disdain. Every time we gathered for a family event, she'd make passive-aggressive comments, drop hints about how David could have done better, and sometimes ignore me altogether. I learned to tolerate her behavior, choosing not to let it tarnish my happiness. Things took a different turn, though, when Kathy suffered a miscarriage. It was a tragedy for anyone to bear, and despite her past behavior, my heart went out to her. I understood the depth of grief she must have been feeling, and David and I did everything we could to support her. We welcomed her into our home more often, thinking that being around family might provide her some comfort. At first, her behavior seemed to mellow. She was still distant and somewhat prickly, but she stopped making her usual biting remarks. I thought maybe, just maybe, we could finally find common ground. But soon, her interest in my son, Tom, grew. She wanted to babysit, take him out for treats, and bring him toys and gifts. Initially, I saw it as her way of dealing with her own loss. Perhaps caring for a child was her way of healing. So, I encouraged her relationship with Tom, thinking that this connection might be beneficial for both of them. However, it wasn't long before her attachment to Tom started to worry me. She'd insist on giving him baths, tucking him into bed, and reading him stories every night she was over. It felt excessive, and a part of me started to feel uneasy. Still, I dismissed my concerns, thinking I was overreacting. Then one evening, I noticed something strange. When I walked into Tom's room to say goodnight, he didn't greet me with his usual bright smile. Instead, he looked at me with a strange, almost curious expression, as if he was unsure who I was. It pierced my heart in a way I hadn't expected. I brushed it off as a child's random mood swing, but the feeling gnawed at me. The next morning, Tom was distant. When I tried to play with him, he pulled away, something he had never done before. Over the next few days, his mood seemed to shift dramatically, and he was less enthusiastic, almost guarded around me. I felt my instincts prickling with concern. This wasn't just a phase, something had changed, and I needed to find out what. When I confided my worries to David, he dismissed them as me being paranoid. Tom's just growing up, he assured me, brushing off my fears with a gentle laugh. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, so I shared my concerns with a close friend. She suggested something that felt extreme at first, installing nanny cams to monitor Tom's room. I hesitated, feeling guilty for even considering it, but the mother in me couldn't ignore my instincts. I ordered 2 cameras, one for Tom's room and one for the living room where he and Kathy usually spent their time. When the cameras arrived, I set them up discreetly, feeling both relieved and ashamed that it had come to this. But I needed to know if my fears were real or just my imagination running wild. For the first few days, nothing unusual appeared on the footage. Kathy played with Tom, read to him, and tucked him in like any loving aunt would. My paranoia started to subside, and I even felt guilty for suspecting her. But one evening, as I skimmed through the footage, something caught my attention. Kathy had pulled a book out of her bag, one I didn't recognize. It wasn't one of Tom's usual bedtime stories. It was a story about adoption and motherhood. And as she read, she added her own chilling narrative. Kathy began to tell Tom that she was his real mother. She wove a story about how sometimes, A mother has to leave her child with another family until she's ready to bring him home. I watched, horrified, as she kissed his forehead, whispering that she would always be his real mom, and that nobody could love him like she did. My hands shook as I watched her words sink into my child's innocent heart. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The pieces started to fall into place: Tom's sudden distance, his strange behavior, the odd looks he gave me. He had been torn between the aunt he adored and the mother he no longer felt he could trust. My heart broke as I realized how deeply Kathy's words had affected him. That night, I could barely sleep. The next morning, I took Tom out for a day of fun, wanting to reassure him and rebuild the bond Kathy had nearly destroyed. We played at the park, ate his favorite pizza, and I showered him with love and attention. Then, gently, I brought up Kathy. I told him that sometimes people say things that aren't true and that he could always trust me to tell him the truth. Tom looked up at me with tear-filled eyes, and the words he whispered broke my heart. Aunt Kathy said you might leave me one day because she's my real mom. I hugged him tightly, assuring him that I would never, ever leave him. He clung to me, his small body trembling with relief. And in that moment, I vowed that I would protect him from anyone who tried to tear us apart, even if that person was family. When we returned home, I confronted David, expecting him to be as shocked and horrified as I was. But his response stunned me. He admitted that he had known about Kathy's behavior for weeks. He thought it was her way of coping with her grief and that no harm would come of it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own husband had chosen to protect his sister's mental health over our son's emotional well-being. At that moment, I knew I had to make a choice. My loyalty was to Tom, to his safety and happiness. And if that meant leaving David and distancing myself from Kathy forever, so be it. I packed our bags, took Tom by the hand, and left. I called my parents and explained everything, seeking refuge in the love and security of the family I could trust. In the days that followed, I felt a mix of grief, anger, and relief. I had lost faith in my husband, but I had reclaimed my son's trust and ensured his safety. I spent those days focusing on rebuilding his confidence, reminding him every day how much he was loved and that he was exactly where he belonged. Looking back on those events, I've come to realize that family isn't defined by blood alone. It's defined by loyalty, by the commitment to love and protect one another. Kathy's betrayal and David's complicity taught me that not everyone who claims to be family truly has your best interests at heart. I also learned that as a mother, my instincts were my greatest asset, and that I would go to any lengths to shield my child from harm, even if that harm came from within the family. This experience has left a scar, but it's also made me stronger. I now know that I'm capable of standing up for myself and my son, of setting boundaries, and of choosing what's best for us, no matter the cost. And that, to me, is the true meaning of family, a bond built on trust, love, and the unbreakable commitment to protect those we hold dear.